Good afternoon and welcome to the second Wednesdays at the Center of Spring 2022, hosted by the John Hope Franklin Center and the Duke Center for International and Global Studies. Today, we are pleased to welcome Duke Professor Bruce B. Lawrence for a talk about his latest book, Islamicate Cosmopolitan Spirit. Professor Lawrence will be introduced by Dr. Robert Rozehnal, Professor of Islamic Studies and South Asian Religions at Duke University, who will also moderate the Q&A. Please remember to keep your microphone muted and to submit questions and comments in the chat. Please let us welcome Professor Robert Rozehnal.
Well, many thanks for that introduction, and to everyone at Duke and the John Hope Franklin Center for making this virtual hour possible. And thanks to all of you out there joining us on Zoom during your busy lunch hour, and even those that'll join us later in the recording. I'm Rob Rozehnal, a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Lehigh University. It's exciting to hear I've been promoted at Duke as well, but at the moment, Lehigh, I'm also the founding director of the Center for Global Islamic Studies, a proud 2003 alum of the Duke Religion Department and Islamic Studies program, and full disclosure, a student of Professor Lawrence. And notice I did not say former student, because I continue to learn from Bruce every day and all the time, as do we all. Bruce B. Lawrence is Nancy and Jeffrey Marcus Humanities Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Religion at Duke University, and the author of many books, numerous edited volumes, and countless articles that collectively span a vast landscape that's as broad as it is deep. If I were to outline the full arc of his intellectual journey and academic career, our 60 minutes would disappear. So by way of introduction, I'll simply say that anyone who knows Bruce understood that his retirement needed to be put in quotation marks. I just did that. That it was simply a matter of shifting title and blurring geography, that no longer teaching and hosting office hours on the Duke campus would in no way diminish his matchless energy, boundless intellectual curiosity, global wanderings, and scholarly productivity. Professor Lawrence's most recent publications include the Bruce B. Lawrence Reader, Islam Beyond Borders, Duke 2021. This is a collection of 24 essays that really span his entire career, masterfully edited by Ali Altaf Mian. The Quran in English, a biography, Princeton 2017. And Who is Allah? UNC Press 2015. Today, we're here to ponder his latest provocative manifesto, Islamicate Cosmopolitan Spirit, which is newly published and available from Wiley-Blackwell. As so much of Bruce's work, this book defies simple summation. In my mind, it's, among other things, a passionate defense and substantive realignment of the paradigm-bending, if contested, legacy of Marshall Hodgson. It's a jihad against reductive essentializing and binary thinking, a warm embrace of the humanities, and a clarion call for rigor, interdisciplinarity, comparativism, and an expansive global perspective for all of us who think about, study, and write about the trajectories of Islam and the diverse lived landscapes of Muslim experience over space and time. Above all, the book's a heady reminder that the terms, categories, labels, and taxonomies that we scholars employ in surveying and interpreting 1,500 years of Islam's global story have profound and lasting consequences. In short, language matters. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, or even those who have, like myself, and are still digesting it, I've asked Bruce to spend a bit of time contextualizing the text from the title to its key arguments, and then we'll turn in our remaining time to a Q&A to spur a discussion. Look, that conversation cannot possibly be comprehensive in this hour, but it's an initial intervention. So with that introduction, I turn the digital stage over to Professor Bruce Lawrence.
Well, thank you, Rob. And thanks all of you who are tuning in for your lunch hour to listen to a few words about this topic, which is, as Rob correctly said, something on which I've spent a lot of time when I think about the fact that I retired from Duke in 2011, I realized that my whole time at Duke really has been thinking about the topic of this particular manifesto. And I sort of imagined at some point I'd write a book, but I never thought I'd write a book quite like this. And I never thought it would have the title Islamicate Cosmopolitan Spirit. I had often thought about cosmopolitan and often thought about what it means to have a cosmopolitan spirit in the way one looks at the world and does one's work. But the term Islamicate kept coming up insistently because, as Rob noted, it stems from the legacy of Marshall Hodgson, and I myself have tried to come to terms with that legacy. And one of the things that I found myself doing in writing this manifesto was keeping track of how rapidly the whole field of Islamic studies has changed from my time when I first began teaching back at Duke back in the early 1970s, when, of course, Hodgson hadn't even been published yet. The book was published in 1974. And it has been off and on remarked by a number of people, but I myself found that I could teach it if I tried to do it in 2 sessions, that is to say 2 semesters in the fall and the spring, and tried to do what's a trilogy of 3, do the early and the middle in the fall semester and do the modern in the spring. And I found out only later that Hodgson himself had devised this book precisely because he was on a tri-semester teaching schedule at the University of Chicago. So that he would do in 1 semester the origin or early history of Islam, or Islamicate civilization, the middle periods, and the modern. So I myself sort of adopted but also modified that spirit and that approach of Marshall Hodgson. But the reason I'm pleased that it became manifesto is because I knew that it was only a start in rethinking the way in which Hodgson might be appropriated in the 21st century. And I myself have written a lot about Hodgson at different venues, but I found that there was the scholarship of people more recently, especially in the last decade, has overtaken anything that was done in the previous 3 to 4 decades since the Venture of Islam came out in 1974. So one of the things that you will note is that it's a manifesto in every sense, that I make points, any one of which could be a subject for a larger discussion and debate, even a refutation, which I welcome, as well as people who might find it to be attractive and a goad for their own thought. But whatever you do and whatever you make of this, the style of a manifesto is sort of, I was trying to describe it to Miriam this morning, it's kind of like a staccato style, like short dicta. You have things you want to say, but you don't want to say too much. You want to say enough to spur discussion and thought, but not enough to drown people in detail. So if you read this book, it will not read like any other book, except maybe perhaps Who is Allah? One of my former students thought that Who is Allah, which, as Rob says, came out in 2015, 6 years ago, was a kind of manifesto, but it was a very gentle manifesto in the sense that I took one topic that everybody knows, or at least everyone's thought about, the term or the word or the name Allah, and then I tried to describe in various ways how to think about Allah and to use Allah and appropriate Allah in different modes, different places, and with different outcomes. But I would say what's different about this is that people don't know about Islamicate. Most of the people whom I've talked to who've read this book or talked about it say, well, I get the cosmopolitan part and the spirit. Everyone likes to have cosmopolitan spirit, but what makes it Islamicate? So I think if you don't have any other outcome in looking at this book, you will get a feeling for Islamicate is an important term to consider, even if you finally reject it, as in fact, one major scholar whom I'll talk about, Shihab Ahmed, did reject it. As somebody has said about Shihab Ahmed's rejection, he spent so long rejecting that one thinks he was also attracted to it. So even whether you come out with Shihab Ahmed and reject Islamicate, or you come out with me and with a few of my stalwart students who still think Islamicate is really a viable term, you rethink what is meant by Islamic and Muslim. And that is the purpose of Hodgson bringing it up in volume 1, is to say that Islamicate is not to disregard Islam or to disavow the importance of Muslim identity, but rather to say that there's a larger part of global history, or what he prefers to call world civilization, a single world civilization which has hemispheric parts, in which there is an Islamicate dimension. So what Hodgson wants to do is not to deride or divide or dismiss Islamic or Muslim, but to say that Islamicate, that extra suffix, that extra word, that unpronounceable, huge qualifier called Islamicate, really expands your vision in how you think about Islam in global history, or what he prefers to call world history. So that's the point of starting. This is why you have a manifesto. It was supposed to be done, just so you know, that being late with a book doesn't always mean that it's bad or wrong, at least I hope not, because I was supposed to have this done by 2011, so it's only 10 years late. But the intervening 10 years means that I'm writing an entirely different book, because the last decade of scholarship, as you can tell from the very first pages of this book, and if you look in the index and you look in the footnotes, you'll see that I've constantly revised and rephrased what I'm going to say, because new books, new articles, new approaches have appeared. And in the final chapter, I decided, instead of trying to summarize everything that I know or that I think can be learned, I point ahead to people who are writing things that have not yet been published. And I must just say that one of the things that was astonishing is I got an email request just yesterday for a conference that's going to start next week on a whole way of using text in Islamicate Text Society that I had mentioned in my monograph as something, in my manifesto monograph, as something that was going to happen. And now it's happening, but it's not happening until next week. So this is not only a work in progress, the whole notion of Islamicate Cosmopolitan Spirit, but there are many points in the whole landscape, or seascape, because seascape, as you will see, is as important as landscape in this book. There are many important points across the globe that are yet to be written and yet to be understood. So one of the questions that another student of mine had asked was, who was the first Islamicate cosmopolitan? And that's an easy question, because this is the person who would be identified. I don't have a picture of him because we don't have pictures going back to the 14th century, but his name is Ibn Khaldun. He comes from North Africa, but North Africa at a time when it was also linked to southern Spain, or what's known as Andalus. So in modern speak, southern Spain, North Africa, in old speak, Andalus and Maghreb was a part of Africa and also of Europe that was under Muslim rule, which concerned Ibn Khaldun. And even though he was living at a time when there was a considerable future for not only Muslim rule, but the spread of Islamic or Islamicate civilization, he saw that history is never uniform and it's never predictable. And what one can do is to try and look very carefully at what has been called history, and instead of making it additive or simply accumulative, to try and make it analytical or diagnostic. And so he writes what I would call a diagnostic history of what went right and what went wrong in the early history for not only Muslims, but other citizens of the world. And in fact, he divides the whole world into what he calls two civilizational parts, one part of which is urban and acidified, but another part of which is Bedouin and rural. And he says, it's not that one is better than the other, both need each other, which is why I come up with this funny term, which Rob mentioned, Barzakh logic. You can't totally replace the Bedouin with the urban or the urban with the Bedouin. They both coexist. Each feeds on the other, each requires and depends on the other. And so in a sense, Ibn Khaldun was not only the first exponent of Islamicate cosmopolitan, but he was also the first exponent of what I call Barzakh logic. That's another word that I just want to introduce so you remember, Barzakh, Barzakh logic. Comes up early in my book, comes up often. It's the way in which I try and show that there are many folds to world history, that there's not a single trajectory that ends with the superiority of either the East or the West, or one group or one religion or one culture over another. So Ibn Khaldun, his muqaddimah, which means introduction, is, as Arnold Toynbee said, the first instance of a really global history. And as Hodgson himself said, the muqaddimah is the first instance of an Islamicate civilization narrative. So here we have the muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun as a book which I showed before. I mentioned Hodgson, whom I will give as a picture because he was such an eccentric personality, and people liked him and people didn't like him, as most eccentric people are considered both in the column of those whom you want to be with and those whom you never want to be with. So here was Hodgson, and the way in which he was described by Saul Bellow, who was a friend of his, and actually, despite the fact that they disagreed on many points, they were conversationalists in Chicago back in the 1960s. In his book, To Jerusalem and Back, reflecting on his own time in Chicago, Saul Bellow said about Hodgson that he was thoroughly pedantic, had no informal manner, was always and everywhere the same, earnest, theoretical, high-minded, stubbornly virtuous. And I think the part I like about that is the high-minded and stubbornly virtuous, because that's what one finds in the venture of Islam. He's trying to think about conscience. So the stubbornly virtuous is that conscience comes before history. You can't think of world civilization without history, but history is informed by conscience. And so in his talk and in his invention of a new category, you can find various books about Islam and Islamic history, but you only find one that's titled The Venture of Islam. And he means that in the sense of an open-ended experiment where there are some variables, some that are constant, some that are changing, but all that have to be considered. And the outcome is uncertain, and the whole process is one that is ongoing or is a venture rather than a delineated and telegraphic and a commonsensical future. So the venture of Islam, conscience and history in a world civilization. For Hodgson, the whole civilization category was something that belonged to the entire world. And so he had intended originally to write a history of the world with Islam as the first chapter or the first part. And instead, because his life was cut short, we were only left with something called the venture of Islam, which, by the way, we would not even have today if it hadn't been for a fellow, not student, but a fellow colleague of his back in the 1960s in Chicago, who recognized the importance of what Hodgson was trying to do. His name is Reuben Smith. He's still alive, lives out in California. He's 94 years old. And Reuben Smith recognized the brilliance of what Hodgson had tried. And so posthumously, after Hodgson's death, he is the one who spent 6 years of his own life, one has to think of the cost of his own scholarly career, putting together the notes of Hodgson into books that became Volume 1, The Classical Age of Islam, Volume 2, The Expansion of Islam in the Middle Periods. And I should just say, parenthetically, that Hodgson completely disagreed with the idea of talking about the medieval period or pre-modern. He was very much into recognizing that there are patterns and shifts in history, but instead of thinking that history was something that had only one trajectory, and the trajectory was towards the outcome for the superiority of either the East or the West, he talked about the early formative periods and the middle and substantive periods of Islamicate civilization, and then the modern period, which he talked about as the gunpowder empires, because gunpowder was so important for the three empires, the Safavid, the Ottoman, and the Mughal, or what Hodgson prefers to call the Indo-Timur. I'm not going to dig down into the weeds. For those of you who know Hodgson, you may be a little disappointed in what I'm going to say, because I could say much more about the temporal shifts and the way in which he used categories of time differently than his predecessors or than many people since his time. But I want to stress instead space, the way in which he thought about a space. And here I'm really grateful to somebody who many of you may know from the University of Chicago, Professor John Woods. His specialty is really medieval Iranian history or the early Mongol period. I've known actually John Woods since the 1960s when we were both students, I an undergraduate and he a grad student at Princeton. He got in touch with me and he was very happy about this monograph and I should say manifesto, which has some elements of a monograph, but is unlike other monographs, at least that I've written. John Woods got in touch with me and said, Bruce, the only thing I'm really missing from your book is the map, but it's a map that I only circulate among my students. So now you're also one of my students. So here it is. And I like this map so much that I decided to include it in my own presentation because it does some things that are very artful that you wouldn't expect to see very often. First of all, it talks about Islamicate boldly. It says the spheres of Islamicate studies, and it has as its 10th element, the Islamicate diaspora. And notice how each of the parts that he delineates never use the term of colonial categories. We don't have the Middle East. We don't have the Near East. We have Western Asia. I could give, and I have given elsewhere, long discourse on why Western Asia is a better category than Middle or Near East to talk about the Mediterranean world that was the beginning of Islam. Hodgson prefers the term Nile to Oxus. He uses the two rivers, the Nile River in Egypt and the Oxus River in Central Asia, to talk about the initial and the grounding experience of the birth of Islamicate civilization. But it also has two elements which he thinks of as, first of all, North Africa and Spain, and third of all, is Iran and the Caucasus. When I asked him, I said, isn't Iran and the Caucasus more important finally than North Africa and Spain? And John's answer, which I think is the correct one, is that they both developed at the same time. And the only reason to include North Africa and Spain as two and Iran and the Caucasus three is that Iran and the Caucasus expands out beyond Iran and the Caucasus to Anatolia and the Balkans, and then also to Central Asia, and to South Asia. But one of the things that's really crucial about the way in which John has put this together is he wants to see the incubation, if you will, the beginning of Islam, as not just in Asia, but also Africa. So he feels very strongly, and of course, Hodgson also did, that there isn't something that's Arab or Persian, but something that's African and Asian. And so the term that's often used, besides Islamicate, by Hodgson and also by John Woods and others who follow this tradition, is to talk about the Afro-Asian, or if you want to put in Europe, the Afro-Eurasian ecumene, ECUMENE. And I will talk often about different geographical markings, but ecumene or Afro-Asian or Afro-Eurasian ecumene is a more accurate way to talk about Western Asia, North Africa, and Spain, but always to include Africa with Asia in the way in which you think about Islam, and not to separate one from the other or to put Europe and the West as a substitute for one or the other. So just to finish this one map, I could spend the entire lecture talking about this map from my friend John Woods, is you also have the expansion to West Africa and to Southeast Asia. And I want to just say, even though Southeast Asia is the 9th on the list, it becomes one of the most important ones for my manifesto and for many ways in which Hodgson envisaged not only a landmass called Islamicate civilization, but also a seascape that included obviously the Indian Ocean, but also included the Arabian Sea, as well as the Mediterranean. So some people often say to me, but isn't the Mediterranean really more important than the Indian Ocean? And my answer to that question, if it comes up in the Q&A, I'll answer it also in more detail, but my simple first answer is, in the initial expansion of Islam, of course, the Mediterranean was the most important. But in the longer view of history, looking back from the 19th and certainly the 20th and now the 21st century, I think it could be argued that the Indian Ocean, the larger expanse of Islam across East Africa, the Indian Ocean, into Nusantara, and the archipelago that includes Indonesia, but also Malaysia and the southern Philippines, that's equally important for Islam today. And then, of course, there's 10, the Islamicate diaspora, which includes Europe and America. And I do not have enough time to discuss this, except very briefly in passing right now. I hesitate to shift gears from simply talking about the geography and the outlook and view of Hodgson to mention Shahab Ahmed. But one of the things that's often happened in the reviews of Hodgson's, people have said, well, the term Islamicate is too awkward. We're going to instead use the word Islamic, and people know that Islamic is more than religion. Among the many people who made that argument that Islamic is more than religion, and you can just leave out the extra suffix, is Shahab Ahmed. And I have mentioned people who've written about Hodgson, but no one has written as fully in both expressing what he thought Hodgson said and in trying to refute Hodgson's outlook than Shahab Ahmed in his book, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, which was published in 2016. So I want to just say, before I get more deeply into Hodgson, that there are people who've been responsive, some corrective, and some rejective of what he said. And among those who are rejective is Shahab Ahmed, who really thinks that the term Islamic can do all the work that Hodgson thought was necessary for Islamicate. So he wrote his own book called What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, which, as I said, came out in 2016. Just to briefly summarize it, it's a deconstructive theory that prioritizes a cosmopolitan perspective. So I mentioned this because my own manifesto would not have been written with a strong accent on cosmopolitan, except as a counterpart, if you will, a voice of contestation, countering what has said by Shahab Ahmed, because he claims that his is an Islamic cosmopolitan outlook, and then he talks about his theory as accenting an under-valorized cosmopolitan perspective that has key term, but it goes against key term biases and disciplinary boundaries, but it always relates to texts. So the questions that Shahab Ahmed asks about Islam are pretext. What is the pretext in both senses? The pretext meaning the instigation or motivation for doing something, the actual text and the context or where it appears. But he tries to make a central argument again and again that he is describing what are coherent contradictions, things like drinking wine or engaging in dance and music or in illicit sexual activities. All these things he claims that happen in Islamic or Islamicate literature are coherent contradictions because they all come under one umbrella that's Islamic. And he dedicates the book to his parents, whom, as he says, raised me in the Islam of their cosmopolitanism and in the cosmopolitanism of their Islam. I want to just linger on that expression because it obviously embodies itself a coherent contradiction, the Islam of their cosmopolitanism and the cosmopolitanism of their Islam. It's never explained in the book itself what is meant either by his parents' outlook or his own outlook that combines these two terms while leaving them in tension. So I asked the question, which came first, or are they indissoluble? And in trying to summarize Hodgson, but also take account of what Ahmed has said, I look at three perspectives. I include my own as a third one, obviously building on developing Hodgson. But there is the first, which is Hodgson, which looks at a coherent civilization called Islamdom or Islamicate civilization. Some other people have talked about the Islamicate ecumene. Whatever the term you use, Islamdom is Hodgsonian, Islamicate is obviously Hodgsonian, Islamicate ecumene is Hodgsonian in double. But the real crucial part beyond the defining of it by Islamdom or Islamicate is it doesn't begin with the birth of the Prophet Muhammad or the coming of Islam, which really starts in the beginning of the 7th century. It starts in the 6th century in 500 because it includes Byzantine civilization and Sasanian imperial history, all of which preceded the development and the emergence of Islam. So Hodgson, in talking about Islamicate, not only develops Islam beyond the time of its first appearance in Arabia with the Prophet Muhammad, but also before Muhammad in both Byzantine and Sasanian or Iranian contexts. So the period for Hodgson is 500 to 1950. And the reason he stops in 1950 because he's an historian and recognizes that many developments happened after World War II that he couldn't account for. So his own point of narration and doing Islamicate civilization is 1950. Ahmed says that the only thing that's really important is not the whole history of Islamicate civilization, but only the part that's cosmopolitan, which for him is 1300 to 1850. So he deliberately takes a shorter frame than Hodgson, even while countering Hodgson. And it's interesting, he calls it Balkans to Bengal, which is very much like Hodgson's Nile to Oxus. So he parallels Hodgson even by disagreeing with him. I talk about both these approaches in my own, which is Hodgsonian starting with 500, but going beyond Hodgson to 2020 to just the most recent period. And here is a map which sort of shows you the globe from Africa to Asia. And here is the Nile to Oxus, which is Hodgson. Here is Balkans to Bengal, which is Ahmed. Now the third one is a teaser for some people who are wondering why I have left him out. But I thought I would just show you that there is somebody who has talked about Islam in both Africa and Asia as part of a larger framework for thinking of Islamicate civilization. And for those who don't realize who I'm talking about, it's Clifford Geertz. And the irony, of course, is that Clifford Gert's book, Islam Observed, is even shorter than mine. It was a kind of manifesto, and I didn't want to talk about it at length because while it goes from North Africa, the Maghreb, Morocco, to Indonesia and Southeast Asia, it only stops at 2 places in each part of the globe and skips over the Indian Ocean, which is why I'm sort of returning the favor and skipping over Gert's. But I am not skipping over religion. So Hodgson, there are flaws in volume 3. Many, many people have written about this. If you want, I can talk about it more in the Q&A. That Hodgson really had his heart and soul in volumes 1 and 2, and then volume 3, which was heavily edited by Reuben Smith, only shows a partial engagement with the modern world. But I would argue that the part of it that he does engage, which he calls a Great Western Transmutation, the GWT, looks at what he calls the high technical age. And in that sense, he was more of a prophetic than simply a reflective or analytic historian. He was talking about the way in which technical changes long before the internet. Remember, this guy dies in 1968. He was talking about what most will define our age is not economics or politics or even philosophical or ideological movements, but technological changes. And I think now in the aftermath of the birth of the World Wide Web and the internet, that we can say that Hodgson was accurate in thinking of the GWT as a transmutation, not limited to the West, but influencing the whole world. So the crucial query which he asks in volume 3, but throughout his work, is not what is Western, but what is the force of Western? Not as a descriptor, as a full descriptor, not as an empty signifier. And how do you do it when you think about what modernity? So briefly, I mentioned 2 people who are Hodgsonians. The Hodgsonian means that they've read Hodgson or studied with him. In the case of the first one, she studied with Hodgson. Her name is Huri Jahan Islamolu. And the second one, Armando Salvatore, as he adopted him as his own weather vane for doing history. So here's Huri. I could talk about my own relationship with her, but that's less important than her relationship to Hodgson. Here she is at a 2014 conference as an economic historian talking about Hodgson and Hodgsonian approaches. Her essay, which was published in 2012 in the Wiley Blackwell Companions to World History, was called, what is this? This is Salvatore's volume, also Wiley Blackwell. They didn't pay me to show you this from Wiley Blackwell, but Wiley Blackwell has been at the forefront of talking about Hodgsonian approaches. So this is the previous one from Huri Jahan Islamolu and a Companion to World History. And now there's the Wiley Blackwell History of Islam by Armando Salvatore. And this is what Huri says, which I think is the most brilliant way of summarizing Hodgson. A rethinking of world history that transcends binaries of West and non-West. But that means also transcending European center and non-European periphery, and also pre-modern and modern. In fact, it implies questioning the identification of modernity with the West, whereby institutions emerging from Western history seem to be attributes of modernity that are universally applied, whereas those from non-Westerners are imported or adopted or resisted. This is what Huri and Hodgson and Hodgsonians oppose, is shifting between a global history or a world history to one that has binaries of East and West and privileges Europe over non-Europe. For Hodgson, all the regions throughout Eurasia, he prefers the term Eurasia or Afro-Eurasia, were involved in historical processes that led to the modern transmutation. Various areas responded in different ways, but they all tried to answer the question of how do we deal with specific trajectories that are once contingent and consequential for us. So I want to come to the end of my presentation and do it in 3 slides. I felt that it's important to just show the modern world as it exists. But this again comes from my friend, Professor John Woods, the University of Chicago. When you look at this, you see 3 empires that are no longer existing, the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal. But when you look at these 3 empires and you see the different colors, you recognize how much of the known world they included, but how much also there were in Muslim lands beyond these empires. So it goes all the way from North Africa and Morocco to the eastern part of Iran and what is now present-day Afghanistan, but also includes the Mughal Empire, all of India, but also extended beyond India to what is now Bangladesh and part of Myanmar. But then it includes areas that are not under any of those rules that are part of West Africa and also part of Southeast Asia, but also a large-scale part of Central Asia. So this is a huge map of the world which shows the influence of what Hodgson would call Islamicate elements or the Islamicate Cosmopolitan Spirit. And that is what is the heart of my own manifesto. So to summarize it, and as I said, I'm doing this staccato style. Each one of these could be the subject of a whole book. The first thing is, why do I emphasize elites? Because elites are part of the Sisyphus-like struggle of bureaucrats, warriors, merchants, industrial, and scholarly elites, all of whom tried to seek solutions to multiple historical challenges. It's not that non-elites don't matter, they matter, but elites dominate the kaleidoscope over time and space when one talks about civilization. And of course, empires also matter. So elites, lives of elites matter, empires matter. The pursuit of a moral life continued in the empires after the Mongol invasions, which is why Hodgson has a long hang on why there is a Mongol element in Islamicate civilization, but there's not a separate Mongol civilization. So the new ideas of statecraft that developed in Islamicate societies, they exceed the borders of Muslim majority empires. They became part of the larger streams of world history. And then there's finally not only lives of elites and empires that matter, but also modernity. This is why Hodgson talked about the GWT, or the Great Western Transmutation, that marked an open-ended vision of history, which you could say had a strong point in the middle periods, but Islamicate societies persist even if Islamicate civilization seems to vanish. So here is my final summary, my last element, then I can open it up to questions and try to give answers to whatever queries you may have. I summarize by saying if Hodgson was a product of the Cold War, which he was, anybody who lived during the 50s and 60s had to be a product of the Cold War. So he was fighting the demons of Western exceptionalism and anti-communism, while himself neither a pro-Western nor anti-communist, but more a Quaker pacifist during World War II, which is why he never engaged in war. And some people have said he liked Sufis more than he liked Muslim warriors, but I would argue that he gave privileges to both. But he was nonetheless a product of the Cold War. And we're also products of our time, the new age of connectivity and global imaginaries, where we have networks of both solidarity and resistance, which are unequal, but still catalog and define the world in which we are. So here are 3 points that we need to consider. The expanse of Islamicate societies, it's not just in the Arab world or even in the Middle East, or what used to be called the Middle East or Nile Axis. It also extends to the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. But in the Islamicate diaspora, pointed out by Professor Woods, it also includes Euro-America and elements of West Africa. And those of us who study Islam must identify and herald those new elites who challenge us with a fresh moral vision and an Islamicate cosmopolitan ethos that seeks to challenge and replace the current world disorder with a sustainable and just new order. So I would argue, my final point is that Islamicate Cosmopolitan Spirit, what I call ICS, is still evident and vital. It still has a future unfolding amid uncertainties, mingling hope with despair, light with darkness in the penumbral 21st century. Thank you very much.
Wow, many thanks, Bruce. As predicted, a lot to digest and think about, and we've got 22 minutes till our semi-hard stop at 1 o'clock. If people are free to linger a bit longer, that too is possible, but it's now my duty and privilege to serve as your virtual MC and mix the board here. If you have a question, please put it in chat. If you prefer to ask it in person, so to speak, that too is possible. I'll start with a chat question that comes from Omid Safi. A two-part question, and you can read this as well in chat, Bruce. How do we use the term Islamicate without minimizing non-Muslim minorities who live in these societies? And can you give examples that distinguish Persianate and Islamicate? Wow, that's another lecture, but that's a great question. You see the question in the chat there, Bruce?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I wouldn't expect anything less from Omid, but he may get less from me than he wants. So the issue about minorities who are non-Muslim and Islamicate societies, I think it resonates in many parts of the world. But again, I think the two places which are really important are Southeast Asia and parts of West Africa. So let me just deal with Southeast Asia since I want to deal with also Persianate. So I think in Southeast Asia, one finds this enormous complexity of society, which had Hindu, Buddhist, indigenous elements of sacrality long before Islam came in the 11th and 12th centuries and expanded much more in the 16th and 17th centuries. And there's a whole history about Nusantara Islam, and many people have noted, among them Michael Feener, that one of the difficulties with Hodgson, as much as he opens up Banus, is that he does not deal enough with the seascape of Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean and maritime regions of the Islamicate world. So that means that non-Muslims don't come up as strongly in volume 3 of Hodgson as they should. And I don't think it's a question of Islamicate minimizing non-Muslims, as the scope of Islamicate itself not extending enough to Southeast Asia and including indigenous groups that are non-Muslim, or groups that become Muslim in different ways that are not easily defined as relate. And no one's used this word, and I don't use it except with hesitation, orthodox or heterodox within a Muslim worldview. So that one of the things that is, I think, helpful about Islamicate is that one can include groups, and I'm going to mention two groups now that many people think are not Muslim. One is the Ahmadis. There's a group from South Asia called the Ahmadis, whom some people would say are non-Muslims. And I think one of the benefits of talking about an Islamicate world is to show how Ahmadis have really been extraordinarily important in the development of a kind of literary notion of the Quran as a book that sells itself rather than has to be sold only as one part of Islam or for one group of Muslims. So Ahmadis is, quote unquote, a non-Orthodox or heterodox version of Islam. But I would say even more strongly, a group that people would say, oh, they're not really Muslims, are the Aga Khanis, people who identify as Ismailis, whom I talk about as probably one of the most cosmopolitan groups in Islam. But the number of times when I have been lecturing in various places in Africa and Asia, and I won't mention them by name, but everybody I can put in their own name, and I say there's a great diversity in Islam, and it includes Ismailis who have a very strong sense of art and architecture. The idea is, oh, they couldn't possibly be Muslims because they're Ismailis. Well, I would argue that art and architecture, as we understand it in the Muslim world, has been expanded rather than reduced. It's been enriched and not impoverished because of the Ismaili participation over history, but because of the Aga Khan, to take one person as leader of the Ismailis, and his own investment in culture and civilization. So the Aga Khan allows me to talk also about Persian and Persianate. So in many parts of the world, the Aga Khan or Ismailis are very much linked to a Persian or Persianate worldview without feeling the need to go back to Arabic and the Arabic Quran or Arab sources of history and culture. So there's a sense in which the Persianate, and this is where Hodgson's contribution is both important and very controversial. Hodgson says in the very beginning, one is talking about Arabic Quran, but not an Arab civilization. So from the very beginning, from the 7th century, not even going on to the 8th and 9th and 10th century, where it's obvious there's expansion of Islam well into realms that are marked by Sasanian culture and by Persian as a language and Persianate influences in culture in general. But Hodgson says very strongly, and this is what I agree, is that there's something called Perso-Arabic, where Persian inflects and affects the way one thinks about Arabic. And there's Irano-Semitic, where there's both Iranian and Semitic elements in the shaping of a civilization that becomes Islamicate. So I would say to Umid and anybody who says, where is this Persianate separate from Islamicate? The answer is, it's really only separate before Islam comes into being. That in every place that you look, even in places in Africa where you say, well, there's no Persian here, it's all Arabic, there's an inflection of looking at local, indigenous, people like to use the term, local elements of Islam that are only peculiar to some areas and not all areas, that this isomorphic realm of Islam, which is accented in various parts of Asia and Africa, really owes its basis to the Persianate element that comes at the very beginning. So I would say that, thank you, Amit, for that question, that the answer to both in some ways converges, that there are non-Muslims within Islamicate realm because Islamicate and Persianate have always been coupled and they can't be decoupled by looking only at Persianate as a sort of minor cipher or a local element of Islam. It's coherent and it's coextensive with the beginning of Islamicate civilization.
Thank you. At this point in the pandemic, I don't think I need to lecture anybody on how to use Zoom, but in case you've forgotten, lower right corner under reactions, you can raise your virtual hand if you'd like to ask a question in person, virtually. In the meantime, several other questions in the chat room. When we talk about your title and the term spirit, it sounds a bit Hegelian, and it takes us, I think, right down the rabbit hole of Barzakh logic. But David Liu asks, how does this spirit you propose work itself through the social material architecture and transfers of transnational orders?
Well, first of all, I'm really happy to get a question from David. David is always one of those people who makes me think more deeply about issues that have an important philosophical basis. And I've thought a lot about the Hegelian notion of spirit, but also thought that spirit, for me, can be wedded to ethos. And one of the things that, to me, is the disappointment and the shortfall of Shahab Oppen's approach is to sort of say that there is no such thing as a spirit separate from religion, that the Islamic spirit is there in everything that I've described and Hodgson's described as Persianate or Islamicate. But I would argue that the spirit, to answer David, forces me to think of the term which I haven't used until now, but have to use. The spirit is embodied above all in adab, A-D-A-B. And even though I try and translate most categories and most terms from Hodgson into this, when I have to answer your question, which I know I'll only partially answer because you and I have had other discussions about whether one can even talk about the modern world without referring to its shortfall, and that the modern and pre-modern and postmodern are not equally and carefully evaluated. But just to use the term adab for a moment, David, and for others who are listening, I hadn't wanted to dig deep into the weeds of either Arabic or Persian in this talk, but I have to use the word adab because adab for me represents at once a notion that's there. It's not there in the Quran, but it's there throughout the whole history of the Islamicate world. And it speaks both about literature and architecture and the performance of, as it were, of an expressive form of art. But the reason why it's spirit is because it can't be pinpointed. It can't be limited. It's a kind of reflex of, to use a word that I use gingerly in the book, it's a reflex of ihsan. Ihsan is an Arabic word, but ihsan, I-H-S-A-N, means that which is both good and beautiful. So this notion that, and this is why David's question is so apt and so important, that the socio-material can't be separated from the ethical. That in the way in which I define, and I think I follow Hodgson in this and other people who are Hodgsonians, that the adab reflects both a stance within, if you will, an Islamic worldview where you accept all of the ritual and literary points of reference for claiming oneself to be Muslim, but there is another element, a surplus of meaning or value that spills over, that is not akhlaq or ethics in a juridical sense, but a spirit, a kind of notion of what it is to be good and beautiful. And that is ihsan. And for those of you who are Muslim who know a little bit about Islam, of course, this is one of the things that comes up in the Hadith of Gabriel, is there is Islam, Iman, and then ihsan is the highest register of what it is to be human, which exceeds being either a believer or being a Muslim. It is seeking the good when you see it, and if you can't see it, know that there is someone else or some other spirit looking at you as you try to be good and beautiful. So that's how I use this, David. I know it doesn't satisfy all of the points of logic which you would bring to this subject, but that's how I try and identify spirit as pervasive in both Hodgson's work and my own.
There's a related comment and question from James Westcote. Wonderful talk. You mentioned the importance of barzakh logic in rural-urban relations. Building on David's question, would you care to comment on the relationship between your ideas about barzakh logic and Hodgson's idea of conscience?
Well, you know, I'm going to say that among the things that I'm most grateful about in having mentioned the Aga Khan and having mentioned the benefit of the Aga Khan is that I've also had the privilege of meeting James Westcote, whom I didn't know before when he was a professor at the Aga Khan Institute of Art and Architecture in MIT. But what he has done is he's given me a beautiful insight into the art and architecture of the Muslim world in India. And at one point I refer to it because he has an essay, for those of you who don't know James, essay called In the Center of the Map, reflecting on Hodgson's idea about conscience and history in the architectural experience of Humayun. And like a lot of other things in life, James, your wonderful essay came to me too late for me to include it in the book, so I included it in a footnote. But to answer your question, I think conscience is exactly what David is trying to get at when he asked me about how do I think about this in the transfer of transnational orders. That there's something that exceeds the national. If I can just quote somebody else whose work came to me too late for me to quote, Manakia has done a book called Persianate Selves, where she says one of the benefits of Persianate for her is allows her to think about a national identity as Iranian in order to express herself in Persian or Persianate terms. And James, as is so true in much of your work, looking at oceans, which Hodgson does a little bit, but not enough. In oceans, oceanic, or what I call Islam Nusantara, or what somebody else, Brand, has called monsoon Islam, that in the whole oceanic experience of Islam, the conscience of thinking about where are values that don't have a religious label or don't have a simple categorical answer from one liturgy or one text or another, but something that is universally recognized as conscience. And for me, that the term that I use and that I think is the only one that can be used to talk about conscience for Hodgson in Islamicate civilization is adab. That adab is not merely an expression in art and in literature, but also an expression of behavior in everyday life. But thank you for that question, and I'm going to look forward to seeing you again in the Research Triangle. Thank you, James.
A previous question from our friend Simi Ghazi. I don't speak fluent Canadian, but I'll try to translate. Could you talk about the new elites? Who are they in your view? What do they share with the elites of earlier periods, and how are they distinct from them?
Well, I expected difficult questions. I knew that Simi would be among the difficult questioners. And fortunately, I was thinking about this question over breakfast this morning with Miriam Cook, my wife and my partner in most of the things I do that are happy in life. So I was saying, how am I going to talk about the new elites? Because I leave so many of them out of the book. There's so many people whom I could have included and should have included in that book. So one of the older ones of these new elites, whom is not in the book, but I think is really important, are all the people who are engaged in critical Muslim, founded by Ziauddin Sadr, but with a whole host of other people who are very, very much new elites. And part of this whole series on critical Muslim, where a former colleague of mine, Ibrahim Musa, and one of the, I don't know if I can show this on the thing, but one of the new issues of this is called World Order, which looks at the whole way in which new Muslim elites are shaping a new world order. And this came out, Critical Muslim 39, and it came out in 2021. I think it was the end of last year. But this is the 39th of a whole volume called CM, Critical Muslims, which I would say expands the notion of elites. So that's one answer to Simi. But the other answer, which is very close to my heart, and I just have to share it with everybody, is the wonderful woman whose art was on the Metropolitan recently, Etel Adnan. I don't cite Etel Adnan as one of the Islamicate Cosmopolitan elites, but her partner, Simone Fattal, certainly was. Simone was also, like her, a person of Mediterranean background, Syrian, Lebanese parentage, and a Christian by birth, and as far as I know, by most of her self-expression. But she got engaged in art and Islamicate art, and she also got engaged in poetry, and she founded in the 1980s something in California called Post-Apollo Press, which is all about experimental forms of poetry and art and how poetry and art interact with each other. So I would, even though Simone Fattal is now a woman in her 70s, I would describe her and many of the young people whom she has published in her Post-Apollo Press as members of this new elite that are harbingers of a future which I'd like to think will exceed Islamicate civilization and still exist in Islamicate spheres.
It's my burden to also keep an eye on the clock. And I think we're drawing close to the end. This question I think will end with, it opens up a whole nother world, but at least Bruce, you might start an answer, if not complete one. This is from Faiza Burak Adli. Thank you, Bruce, for the amazing talk. As you said, while there were disagreements between Ahmed and Hodgson, at least they were both exponents of the cosmopolitan spirit of Islam. Mm-hmm. Another intellectual with whom Ahmed disagrees is Talal Asad. What do you think of Assadian approach to Islamic tradition, which tends to juxtapose Islam with a so-called Western liberal secular tradition in a way that undermines the cosmopolitanism of Islamic traditions? That's a vast question, but
you know, I didn't expect anything less from Faiza. I knew that she would ask a question, but I didn't realize it would focus on Talal Asad. And of course, I've just finished doing an essay for Critical Times on rethinking religion through Wittgenstein, which was a long essay by Talal, where I both agreed and disagreed with him. So, Faiza, first of all, it's just so wonderful to see you, and I'll never answer your questions like David Liu. You will ask me questions which will keep me questioning myself long after the show is over. But just to answer in a very brief time, I think that Talal Asad, in his later years, in his self-expression in articles more than in his books, has tried to see an expansive Muslim civilization which is not always juxtaposed Western, liberal, and secular, as in some ways opposite to Islamic cosmopolitanism. And I take it that this may be one of the places where I think you would agree, and I certainly found myself agreeing, that in thinking of mind, soul, and trying to do soul, body, and mind, body, and trying to expand the notion that Islam is just something that is one tradition where you have to work through words, but you also have embodiments or expressive or performative notions of Islamic identity. And as I try to say in my response to his essay on Wittgenstein, I agree with his new turn of his, which tries to embody, literally embody Islam and Islamicate notions in a cosmopolitan vein. But where I find that he needs to expand it is in the notion of community. That there still is an absence that's still focused more on individual. And you may say, well, I do the same thing in talking about elites, but I try and put elites within various communities and these communities within the context of history. And I think the Assadian approach to Islamic tradition, while it's very important, and while I value Assad, and by the way, we have a whole discussion on where I agree and disagree with Ahmed's evaluation of Assad, that the discursive tradition that Assad emphasizes downplays too much the motive. And I think actually Talal is responding to Ahmed in this recent essay on rethinking religion through Wittgenstein, but where he still comes short, in my humble view, is in failing to accent that community is the context. It's not really the pretext. It's also the context, to use the terms of Shahab Ahmed. The context is the community, and the community is now a multifocal world where we can be in touch with through internet with people from different communities, and I can even get a chance to try and answer your questions online. So thank you.
There are several comments and follow-up questions in the chat room, so I invite Bruce to take a look at those and respond as he sees fit after the fact. Bruce, I'm just curious, are there any final concluding thoughts you want to leave us with as we leave the virtual realm?
Well, as we leave the virtual and go back to the actual, if there is such a dividing line anymore, I would say that I'm really grateful to all the people who've come online and spent their noon hour doing this. But what I really find most exciting to me is that this is a book which I could not have imagined writing in 2011. And I can't imagine that what I wrote in 2021 will still be the same in 2031. But the new generation, the people who are thinking about Islamicate studies, like Faiza and like David and like you, Rob, and like Umid, I think will be voices that will reassure that there is an adab, or to quote James Westcott, that there is a conscience along with a history of Islamicate civilization. And I look forward to being part of it.
Beautifully said. Really, thanks to all of you for joining us today. This will be recorded, so you can return to it as you wish. And most of all, Professor Lawrence, 1,000 thanks for this book and for this conversation, with many other discussions to come, inshallah. Thank you all for being here. Much appreciation to everyone at Duke who made this possible, and hope to see you all again in the real world sooner than later.
Thank you, Rob.
Many thanks.
Thank you, Professor Lawrence and Professor Rozehnal, and thank you to all the attendees who joined us today. Wednesdays at the Center continues next week on February 9th with Dr. Nishani Frazier, Associate Professor of History and History at the University of Kansas, for the talk, The Making and Unmaking of One America. Thank you again, and we hope to see you next Wednesday. Have a great day.